the closed toilet, and opened the checking account app. I had set up alerts in October when we were tightening belts, and I scrolled through the push notifications from that day, and there it was like a bell you do not want to hear. Riveria Fine Jewelers, $4,862.79, and another on the same day, Elk Ridge Lodge, $1,298, and a third from a travel site for 2 lift tickets at Taos, and the dates were December 24th through December 26th, and my hands went cold in a way that felt like grief. He has family in Santa Fe, he could say, and we could stay there, he could say. But we had already told his mother we were staying home this year because I had to work the morning of the 24th to cover filings before the holiday closure, and because his bonus would go to the blue binder, and because we had agreed to buy each other only small gifts, something sweet, not something large, and because our dog gets anxious in strange houses and does better at home. He came out of the shower and asked why I looked pale, and I said, "I think I ate too much frosting." And he made a fake sympathy face and said the cake was gross anyway, and he grabbed his phone from the nightstand, saw a message, grinned, and thumb-typed, quick and secret, like a teenager. I slept very little. I lay awake thinking about the money and the bracelet and the way Evan had started lifting his phone and tilting it away, and how he had begun to tell me I was too intense when I asked about timelines, not just for money, but for plans, and how he switched topics when I said the blue binder was not a hobby, it was a responsibility, and how he laughed about my job like it was nothing, even though every day I see what happens when people do not respect dates, documents, and details. In the morning, I fed the dog and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the blue binder open, and I pulled my notebook from my work tote and I wrote down what I knew: dates, numbers, places, and I wrote down questions. Why Taos? Who is traveling? Why the lodge booked as E. Alvarez Party of Two? And I wrote down the name of Evan's HR director, which I knew because I had met her at a legal aid fundraiser, and she'd laughed at the judge's jokes a little too hard, and I wrote down the words code of conduct because Evan had bragged in October that he got to sign a new one as a team lead, and that it was all corporate nonsense. And I remembered how he said that the bonus was discretionary and tied to ethics, and that the CFO liked to claw back money if people broke rules, and I circled that 3 times. The humiliating part was not only that he spent money on another woman. The humiliating part was that he used our plan to cover his plan and made me the fool in my own kitchen. The woman who believes the binder while he writes a different story behind her back. And I felt anger rise like heat from the stove, steady and dangerous. But I did not slam the binder shut. I did not throw his mug. I did not call Bree names. I did not even cry. Because the courthouse has taught me that mess does not fix mess. Paper fixes mess, and witness, and timing. I made a second coffee and I took the dog on our usual loop, and I said hello to Mrs. Luna and waved at the boy on the scooter who always forgets his helmet. And I told myself to breathe, and I tried to find my center, which is the part of me that says, you get to choose what happens next. When I came back, Evan was at the table with his laptop open. He had put on a hoodie and a smile. He said he had to run some errands for his team, last-minute Secret Santa, long lines, you know, and he kissed the top of my head and asked if I needed anything from the craft store, and I said no thank you, and he left fast like the hallway was a tunnel and there was light at the end. I sat down at his chair and looked at the browser tabs still open, because this is our house, and we are not spies, but sometimes browsers tell the truth. And I saw the hotel confirmation again, and a search for how to surprise someone on Christmas morning, and an order for a winter scarf in a color I do not wear, and tickets for a line dancing night at a lodge bar that does live music on holidays. I took photos with my phone, then closed every tab so I would not be tempted to stare at them like they could change what they were. I went to work. On my lunch break, I walked down to the basement where the public computers are, and I printed the bank activity page and the hotel booking with the guest names blocked out. And I printed 3 months of statements and tucked them into a manila folder that used to hold a court map. And I wrote my name on the tab because people take things less from you when your name is in ink. I did not tell anyone. I did not tell my mother because she would have called Evan and told him in a storm of Spanish and fear. And I did not tell my friend Lila because she would have driven to Evan's office and made a speech. And I did not tell my sister because she has 2 kids and no time for my heartbreak that week. And I did not tell my boss because even though she is kind, she is also a person who gossips without meaning to. And I wanted this to be clean. Evan texted me a photo of a mug with a cactus that said Feliz Navidad and wrote, "For Bean," which is our dog. And I wrote, "Cute." And he sent a string of hearts that looked like confetti if you did not know what he had done. That afternoon, I pulled up the New Mexico rules for ex parte orders and initial filings, not because I wanted a scene, but because I wanted a plan. I looked at the holiday schedule for the courthouse. We close at noon on the 24th, but we run a duty judge for emergencies. Divorce is not an emergency, but filings can still go in, and process servers like the holiday rush because people are home, and I felt an idea settle into place. Not a petty idea, not a vengeful whisper, but a boundary with a shape. When I first met Evan, he said he loved that I was the kind of woman who made her own plan when the city snowplow didn't come, that I put cat litter in the trunk for weight and parked facing uphill. And I believed he meant it. And maybe he did then. But somewhere along the way, he started calling it controlling. And that small insult had grown like a leak behind a wall. And now, the wall was swelling. After work, I stopped at my mother's and gave her a bag of tamales I had promised to pick up. And she said, "When are you coming on Christmas?" And I said, "Maybe in the evening." And she said, "Bring Evan late so your Tio doesn't start in on politics." And I smiled and nodded and kissed her forehead and said yes, and told myself there was no rule that said I had to carry other people's expectations through a fire. When I got home, there was a bag under the tree with my name on it in Evan's handwriting and a bag with Bean's name in big letters. And Evan was wrapping something at the dining table with tape and too much ribbon. And he looked up and said, "You're going to love Christmas this year. I have plans." And I said, "I bet you do." The next day was Saturday. We cleaned the house. He called his mother and told her we might swing by Christmas morning if work allowed. And when he said work, he winked at me like we were partners in a heist. And I nodded like I did not know that his work was a lodge in Taos, and a bracelet in white gold, and a bed that was not ours. He asked if I could please handle a last-minute grocery run because he forgot we were out of cinnamon, and I said sure. And I took the dog for another loop, and then drove not to the store, but to the bank. I sat with a woman named Tessa who wore a sweater with sequined reindeer and a tired smile, and I moved half our joint checking into my separate account that we had never closed after the wedding, and I set alerts for transfers, and I printed the list of automatic drafts that would fail if the account went to zero, because I am not the kind of woman who burns down her own house to watch someone else cough, and I wanted the lights on and the dog fed while I made my moves. From the bank, I drove to a copy shop. I made duplicates of the statements and the hotel reservations and the photos of the bracelet that I had pulled from a coworker's Instagram story because she filmed the clink and captioned it goals. And I bought a cheap flash drive and saved digital copies because paper can get wet. I went home, made cinnamon toast, and watched Evan fall asleep on the couch with the dog curled behind his knees. And for a moment, something old and soft tugged at me, because we have 1,000 quiet moments that are not a bracelet, and not a lodge, and not a lie. And I almost let the soft thing speak. But then he stirred, smiled in his sleep, and whispered a name that was not mine, and the soft thing broke like a crust of ice, and I stood, and I washed the plate, and I checked the clock, and I told time to move. On Sunday, I called a process server. His name was Ramon, and he had a voice like a tire rolling slow on gravel. And he said the holiday rate is double because some people want to ruin Christmas. And I said, I do not want to ruin anything. I want to end something that is already broken, and I will pay the rate. And he said, you sound like you have your head on straight. And I said, I do. He asked for the address where Evan would be on Christmas morning, and I gave him his mother's house in Santa Fe because Evan always stops there for cocoa before any snow plan. It is tradition, and he is a man who loves tradition as long as it serves him. Ramon said he could do it at 9 a.m., between gifts and breakfast when people are most likely to answer the door, and he asked if I wanted a photo for proof, and I said no. I will take the proof stamped by the court, and he laughed as if we had a private joke. If you think I was calm through all of this, I was not. I put on calm like a coat. Under it, I was electricity. But the courthouse has taught me to use my electricity to power something, not to set fires I did not choose. The humiliating conflict had shaken my world. It had made me a fool in public and a stranger in my own kitchen, but it had also reminded me that I am a person who builds and who knows how systems work. That is the part of me that interested Evan at first, and the part that bored him later, and the part I would need now. I made a list for the next days. Monday, call HR Director Candace with a neutral voice and a question about policy, then let her make the connections without me tutoring her. Tuesday, pick up certified copies of our marriage certificate and the deed to the house that I bought 2 years before we married, and which we kept in my name because my grandmother asked me to keep it. Not because I didn't trust him, but because she wanted the house to flow through the women in our family, and when I remembered that detail, I felt a small, hard joy in my chest. Wednesday, talk to a legal clinic volunteer on my break, not to get representation but to get a checklist, because checklists are rails when the ground is slick. Thursday, get the forms in order, here a petition, there a request for temporary support, there a notice about the dog because Bean is a life, not an asset. And I wanted that in writing because people get petty when they are exposed. Friday, breathe. Saturday, rest. Sunday, wrap my mother's gifts and tell her I might see her later than planned. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because the truth would be heavier if I said it before I could carry it all the way. On Monday morning, I dressed for work in gray and navy, the colors that make me feel like a wall that cannot be moved, and I walked into the building with my badge out and my chin level. I logged into my terminal and sorted filings and nodded to a man who was there to file a name change and who looked like he had not slept, and I told him softly that the forms are not as hard as they look, and he smiled in a way that made me want to be kind forever. And then I stepped into a quiet hallway and called Candace from HR. I told her I was confirming the policy about supervisors dating direct reports, and the words came out smooth like I was reading from a guide. And she said, "We take that very seriously. Why do you ask?" And I said I prefer not to give details. But I thought something might be happening with Evan and a member of his team, and I said it in a voice that was not bitter or shaky. And she said, "Thank you for calling." And I told her I had documentation, and she said, "You can email it to this address." And I said, "I prefer a handoff." And she said, "I can meet you at noon near the Courthouse Cafe." And I said, "Fine." At noon, she showed up in a coat too thin for December and a mouth too thin for jokes, and I handed her a sealed envelope with copies, not originals, and a simple note that said, "Riveria Fine Jewelers, Elk Ridge Lodge, lift tickets for 2. Confirmation shows 2 guests, initials EA, dates December 24 to 26, and her eyes flicked across the lines and then up to mine, and she said, "We will review," And I said, I know you will. And she said, this could impact bonus eligibility. And I said, that is between you and your policy. And she said, if we have questions, we will reach out. And I said, if you do, I will answer. And she said, I hope your holidays are peaceful. And I said, I am making sure of it. That afternoon, I typed my own forms at a public terminal like any other person who is doing something hard with a deadline. I filled in the boxes with my name and Evan's, the date of marriage, the date of separation listed as Christmas Day, because the truth of it was shaped like that, even if the heart of it had cracked the week before. And I requested that the court consider temporary orders to keep the bills paid and the dog with me, and I attached the exhibits with small labels, and I printed everything in triplicate and placed them in a folder with clips that do not bend when you breathe on them. When I left the building, it was already twilight, and the mountain was the color of a cut watermelon, and the air stung my cheeks in a way that made me feel clean. I drove home with the radio off and the window cracked, and I thought about what it means to set a boundary in a world that tells women to keep forgiving till they disappear. I am not a saint. I am not patient by nature. I like things lined up, and named and done. But even I had let the small slights slide because love gives you a soft lens. The bracelet was not soft. The plan was not soft. The lodge in Taos was a hard line on a map, and I decided to answer a line with a line. That night, Evan cooked spaghetti and told me a story about a coworker who tripped on a power cord and pulled an entire printer to the floor. And I laughed in the right places and asked 2 questions like a person who is present. And then I asked him how much the bonus was this year. And he said less than usual. The company was tightening belts. And I asked him if it had hit the account yet. And he said not yet. Maybe later in the week. And we both looked at the blue binder on the corner of the counter, and he took a sip of his wine and changed the subject to a TV show, and I saw him see that I saw him, and he smiled to cover it. And I smiled back, because sometimes a mirror is as sharp as a knife. On Tuesday, I took an early lunch to the county clerk to pull certified copies of our marriage certificate and to request a copy of the deed my grandmother signed over to me a decade ago. The clerk knows me, but today she did not ask why, because people who deal in paper know that reasons are often private, and she stamped the gold seal on the certificate and slid it across the counter with a neutral face like a gift without a card. I put it into the folder and closed the clips tight and walked to a cafe where a couple was arguing about whose family to see when, and I watched them and thought about how small choices become fault lines. On Wednesday, my friend Lila texted me a meme about ugly sweaters and asked what we were doing for New Year's. I typed, "Not sure yet," and I looked at the blinking cursor and almost told her everything, but I did not. Not because she would not hold it well, but because telling too early is like lifting a cake before it sets. I needed the edges to hold before I cut it. That night, Evan said he had to run to the office to drop off a thing he forgot, and I said, okay. And he left wearing cologne he only uses for parties, and half an hour later Bree posted a story of a bar's neon sign in a strip mall I recognized, and I felt tired. Not even angry anymore. Just tired the way your legs feel at the top of a hill when you realize you still have to go down. On Thursday, I went to the legal clinic at lunch, and a woman with gray hair and a soft voice gave me a checklist printed on pink paper because the white paper was out, and that made me smile more than anything had in days, and we went through the list line by line. Do you share children? Number. Do you share a mortgage? No. The house is mine. Pre-marriage. Do you share pets? Yes. 1. Do you share debt? Some. Do you fear for safety? Number. Do you have documentation? Yes. She looked at my folder with the care of a person who loves order and she said, "You are ready." And I believed her. On Friday, I ironed my one good blouse even though I could have worn a sweater because ironing calms me, And then I made pozole for my mother and let it simmer while I checked the forms one more time, and I placed a sticky note on the top that said file first thing December 24th, and I put my keys on top of the note so I could not leave without touching the plan. Evan came home whistling with a bag of things that crinkled and said, "Big day tomorrow," and I said, "For sure." He asked what time I had to work, and I said 8 to noon, short shift, and he said, "Perfect. We could do something after." And I said, "Sure." And he grinned and kissed me like the movie version of a husband, and the dog wagged because she does not read subtext, and I petted her head and told her we were okay. Saturday, I did nothing on purpose. I watched corny movies with my mother and did her nails in a color she calls church red, and I let myself feel small again so I could be big later. Sunday night, he checked his phone every 5 minutes like a boy counting down to a secret. I set my alarm for 6. When it went off, the sky was still black and the house was still warm because the heater finally worked right after the repair. I dressed, grabbed the folder, kissed the dog, and told Evan I'd bring back breakfast burritos after my shift. He said, "You're the best," and I said, "I know." I drove to the courthouse through empty streets where the lights still blinked red and green because the city had not switched them to day mode yet, and when I parked, I could see the outline of the mountain, a dark shoulder against the lighter dark, and I felt calm like I feel when all the names are written and all the pages are clipped. I walked in with the other early workers and said good morning to the guard and went to my station, and at 8 on the dot I took a break and stepped to another window, not mine, and handed over my petition. The clerk stamped it with the date and time, December 24th, 8:03 a.m., and the sound of the stamp was the sound of a chapter closing. I paid the fee, then walked to the duty desk to schedule service. Ramon texted me a thumbs up from the parking lot because he had come to pick up the packet in person, and I handed him the sealed envelope with Evan's name on it, and the address in Santa Fe, and the note that said, "Please serve at 9 a.m. on December 25th. Merry Christmas." And he laughed under his breath and said, "You sure?" And I said, "I am." And he said, "All right then." And I watched him leave into the cold with my future under his arm like a newspaper. I did not feel mean. I felt exact. I felt like the person I am when I do my job, which is to say, I felt like myself. And as I walked back to my window, I slipped my phone into my pocket and told myself that when Evan opened his Christmas morning at his mother's house, he would find a gift he had earned, and I would be at peace with my own. The rest of that day moved like a river under ice, and I kept my head down and did my work, and checked the clock only when a filing jammed or a printer coughed, because it was easier to stand in a steady line than to look ahead at the bend. And at noon, I ate half a burrito at my desk and watched the courthouse trees flicker with the cheap colored lights we hang every year, and I told myself to stay on the rails, and I did, until my phone buzzed with a number from Evan's company and I stepped into the stairwell to answer because the stairwell is the only place in the building where voices do not bounce. And Candace from HR said, "Thank you for the packet. We have opened a review. We have initiated a hold on all discretionary payouts tied to ethics, and we will speak to Evan after the holiday." And her voice was frosty like the kind of piece you put on a wound so it will not swell. And I said thank you and hung up, and felt the tiniest thread of relief pull through the knot in my chest. When I got off at noon, I picked up breakfast burritos from the truck on Lomas and brought them home, and put 2 into the freezer and set one under the tree with a note for Bean, even though she cannot read, because I needed one silly kindness in the room. And Evan met me in the kitchen with a grin and said, "You spoiled me." And I said, "That is not a new habit." And he laughed and asked if I wanted to open one gift early, and I said yes, because agreeing was the easiest path to quiet. He handed me a box with tissue paper that smelled like the perfume drawers at a store, and inside was a scarf in a pale mint color that makes me look like I am seasick, and I ran my fingers over the knit and said, "Thank you, because it is still a gift." And he said, I saw it and thought of your eyes, and I said, my eyes are brown. And he laughed like that was cute, and said I knew that. And I folded the scarf back into the paper, and I handed him a book by a writer he likes, because I had picked it before all of this, and it was still true that he likes this writer, and he said great, and tapped the cover like a promise he would not keep. At 3 in the afternoon, my phone chimed with 2 alerts from the bank. One for an ATM withdrawal near his office for $900, and the other for a swipe at a ski rental shop for $320. And a third that told me the balance in the joint account had dropped below a threshold I had set months ago when we were being careful. And I looked at the blue binder sitting on the end of the counter like a silent guest, and I moved my body slowly, like any sudden motion would draw attention to the steadiness I was trying to keep. And I opened the cabinet to get a glass, and I drank water and let it sit in my mouth before I swallowed, because it is hard to speak kindly when your throat is dry. He asked if I was okay, and I said, I am fine. I am making a grocery list. And he nodded and said, do we have cinnamon? And I said, yes. I already got it. Later, while he was taking the dog into the yard to play fetch in the last light, my phone lit up again with a number I did not know, and the voice belonged to Ramon. And he said, we are still on for 9 a.m. service. And I said yes, at his mother's. And he said, I will be there 10 minutes early. And I said, thank you. And when I hung up, I felt a tremor. Not fear, but the shift you feel when a long train changes tracks. Dinner was simple. Pasta, jarred sauce, a bag salad I punched open at the seam, and Evan poured wine and told me he had to run an errand later, a quick one, just picking up something from a friend, and I said okay and asked if he needed help. And he said, no, it is a surprise for you, and he wiggled his eyebrows like a schoolboy prank, and I smiled like a woman who cannot be moved by eyebrows anymore. After he left, I pulled out the small suitcase from the hall closet and put into it what I would need if I slept at my mother's that night or the next. Not because I thought I would, but because I like to be able to leave on my own terms if a room turns. Toothbrush, socks, a sweater that does not itch, the folder with copies not originals, the dog's favorite rope toy, and the ring dish my grandmother gave me that says sempre in letters worn thin by years of hands. And I stood for a moment in the quiet house and listened to the heater click and the kitchen clock tick, and my heart say, you can do hard things. He came back at 9 with a grocery bag full of ribbon and a smile and a smell of bar soap that was not the brand we use, and he came up behind me while I was washing a pan and slipped his arms around my waist and said, hey, and I kept my hands in the water and said, hey back, and we stood like that for a minute. And then he said, I'm beat, I'm going to bed. And he went down the hall. And I dried the pan and set it in the rack and checked the locks and turned off the tree lights and went to bed too. And I listened to his breathing. And I thought about how intimate it is to know someone's sleep sound and how lonely it feels when that sound is a wall, not a comfort. On Christmas morning, I woke before my alarm, and the sky was a smooth, dark bowl, and the street was empty, and the city felt like it was holding its breath, and I made coffee and fed the dog and set out the burrito I had saved, and I wrote my mother a text that said, I will come by later with pozole and a pie, and please do not start the stories without me, and she sent a heart. And I smiled, because some people hold you up without knowing. At 7, Evan came out in his coat and said, I am going to grab gas and cocoa at Mom's. Want to come? And I said, I promised to meet a neighbor about a thing. I will catch up. And he said, all right. And he kissed my cheek and left. And I stood at the window and watched him back his car out of the driveway quick, like he was late for a flight. And I told myself to stand still. At 8:54, Ramon called and said, I am on the street. Lights are on. I see a wreath. And I said he should be there any minute. And at 9:07, he called again and said the mother answered, Sweet lady, cocoa on the stove. said he came by at 7:15 at most, kissed her on the head, took a thermos, and left for Taos. And I felt the floor tilt under me even though I was sitting, and I said, "Thank you." And he said, "I will go to the lodge. But the roads are slick. It will take time." And I said, "Go slow. Do not die for my paperwork." And he laughed and said, "I am not dying for any man's paperwork." And he hung up. And I sat there with my hands around my mug that had gone cold, and looked at the tree and felt the kind of anger that is not loud, the kind that is a clean line inside your chest. 5 minutes later, my phone dinged with a photo from Evan's mother that she had sent to a family thread, and not to me. But someone had forwarded it to me because families are leaky boats at the holidays, and the photo showed Evan standing in front of a small chapel in Chimayo on the way north, and next to him was a woman whose face was mostly hidden by a red scarf and big sunglasses, but her hair was a color I had seen under the party lights, and the caption said, "My boy stopped by for a Christmas kiss on his way to the slopes." And I put the phone face down on the table and stared at a spot on the wood where a stain looks like a tiny map of the state, and I breathed in and out until I could feel my hands again. At 9:30, Candace called, which surprised me because it was a holiday, and she said, "I only have a minute, but I wanted to let you know that his bonus has been placed on hold effective immediately." And I said, "Thank you," and felt that tiny thread pull again. And she said, "Our payroll system closed the run Friday, so if there was a deposit scheduled, it might not hit." And I said, "I understand." And she said, "I hope your day brings you peace." And I said, "I am working on it." 10 minutes after that, the bank sent an alert that a hotel charge had been adjusted and then reversed, and another alert that an attempt to run my card in the joint account had failed, and a third that the account had been swept of the remainder by a transfer to a secondary checking I had not even known he kept, because you can love someone and never know how many pockets are in their coat. And I closed my eyes and whispered to no one that the lights would stay on because I had moved my half, and I would not let his winter drown my dog. At 10:15, he texted me a picture of a snow-dusted fur with a caption that said, "Merry Christmas, babe, wish you were here," and a heart. And I stared at the sentence and felt that sharp little humor that comes from absurdity, and typed thanks. The dog says hi, and he sent a laughing emoji like we were still doing inside jokes. And I set the phone down and walked to the sink and washed a mug that was already clean, because sometimes you need to do a small task so your brain does not run down the hill too fast. At 11, a number I did not recognize popped up again, and when I answered, a quiet voice said, "Hi, Nora, it's Bree." And hearing her say my name made me feel like I had stepped onto a floor I did not know was there. And I said hello and waited, because I have learned that if you wait, people will bring you where they are. And she said, "This is strange, and I am sorry to call you at all. But I needed to tell you that I did not know he was still with you. He told me you were separated. He told me you were sleeping in different rooms. He told me he was going to tell his mother today, and then you, next week." And I heard the shape of her words, and pictured his lips moving around them, and I let 3 beats pass, and then I said, "We are married, and we share a bed and a dog and a kitchen, and he took you to a lodge with our money, and there is a company policy he signed, and I am not calling you names because I have enough work to do without adding meanness to the pile, but I will say that I have filed, and he will be served. And I wish you good sense moving forward." And there was a long quiet like the space in a church after the last note of a song, and she finally said, "I am sorry." And I believed she was sorry in the way people are sorry when they realize they helped build a thing they did not mean to live in. And then she said, "We are in room 413. He is at the rental shop right now. He will be in the lobby at noon to meet me for lunch." And I took that in and asked why she was telling me. And she said, "Because I am not going to be part of a lie, and because I do not like who I am when I am next to him, and because you sounded like you had your head on straight when you said paper fixes mess, and I wanted to help you fix. And then she said goodbye and hung up before I could say anything else. I texted Ramon the room number and the time like I was reading a bus schedule, and he texted back 3 thumbs up and 1 snowflake and wrote on my way. And I stared at his text and smiled for the first time that day because even small humor is food. It snowed on the mountain around noon, the kind of flakes that look like sifted flour in the bright air, and it rained in my town, and I drove to my mother's to drop off the pozole and kiss her cheeks. And she said, "Where is Evan?" And I said, "Not with me." And she looked at my face and did not ask more because she knew better. And she tucked a tamale into my coat pocket like armor and said, "Eat later," and I promised I would. And as I turned to leave, my phone rang and it was Evan, and his voice had an edge I know from times he does not win. And he said, "What did you do to the bank?" I tried to run my card and it bounced. "What did you do?" And I said, "I moved money to cover the bills tied to my name and the house, and the rest is yours." And he said, "You cannot do that. It is our account." And I said, "I can move my half to protect the basics." And I did. And he said, "You are being controlling again." And I said, "I am being careful." And he said, "We need to talk when I get back." And I said, "We will talk when you are honest." And he sucked in breath like he had just stepped into cold air and said, "I am honest." And I said, "Then, who is wearing the bracelet in the lobby of a lodge 2 hours north?" And there was nothing but the sound of a crowd behind him and the clink of plates. And then he said, "We will talk later," and hung up like a door closing in a storm. At 12:40, Ramon called and said, "I am in the lobby, and I see your husband and a woman at a table by the window. Security is watching me because I look like a man with a purpose." And I said, "You are." And he said, "I will wait until they stand, and then I will approach, because if I do it at the table, a manager might get loud." And I said, "Okay." And I pictured the room, the tree in the corner, the boots lined up by the door, the sign with lodge rules written in a pretty script that makes rules look like wishes. And I breathed. 5 minutes later, he texted 3 words. Security moved me, and I felt my body tense like a rope in a tug. And I waited. And then, 3 more words. They are leaving. And then a photo of a glass door and 2 coats moving through it. And then a call that went to voicemail because my phone was in my coat pocket. And his message said they saw me, and the guy grabbed the woman's hand and went out a side door, and the valet waved them to a path that cuts to the lifts, and I could try again at the base, but guards are getting jumpy with me, and I leaned against my car in my mother's driveway and let my head tip back and looked up at a sky the color of a dishcloth, and I thought, all right then, and I called him back and said, "Go home if you need to go home. This is not worth a scene." And he said, "You hired me because I do not scare easy. I will try one more time by the rental shop." And I said, "Okay, but only if you can do it safe." And he said, "Safe as houses." And I hung up and stood there and let the cold push my anger into a shape I could hold. At 1:15, Evan's mother called me and said, "I do not like to get in the middle, but why are you not with my son today?" And I said, "Because he is somewhere else today." And she said, "Do not be dramatic. It is Christmas." And I said, "I am not being dramatic. I am being direct." And she said, "You Alvarez women are so proud." And I said, "We are not proud. We are careful." And she sighed and said, "I raised him right." And I said, "I believe you tried." And then she said, "I hope you work it." Out and hung up before I could say, I hoped he worked it out with himself. At 1:30, my phone buzzed again, and it was Ramon's voice, low and a little out of breath, and he said, "Got him at the path by the lifts. He tried to put his hands up like I was a cop. I told him I was not. I told him I had something official. He said he would not take it. I said, Receipt of service does not require consent. He said some names I will not repeat, and I said I stayed polite. And then a lodge manager came up and told me I could not do business on resort property. And then a guard stepped between us like we were two men at a bar. And I did not drop the packet because we were still moving and I did not want it in the snow. And then your husband stepped backward and the woman stepped too. And they slid by a rack of skis and a boy in a helmet. And then they were on the lift ramp. And the manager put a hand on my chest and he had a badge so I did not push past. And now I am in the parking lot, breathing like a man who has run in boots. And I am sorry. And my first thought was not anger at him, but a picture of the boy in the helmet and how a fight could have knocked him down. And I said, "You did right. The boy comes first." And he said, "I will try at the end of the day when they come down, or at the restaurant again at dinner." And I said, "Only if you can do it safe." And he said, "I have a plan." And for the first time that day, I laughed without feeling mean. At 2, I drove home with Bean because I needed to be in my house for a while, even if it felt like a stage between scenes. And I fed her and sat on the floor and let her put her head on my knee. And I told her what a good dog she is. And she wagged like praise is food. And then I stood and did the small tasks that keep a home alive, because when the big thing is out of your hands, it helps to fold towels. I put on the scarf he gave me because it was on the chair, and I have a mean streak when I am tired. And I caught sight of myself in the microwave door and took it off, because I will not decorate myself with someone else's bad taste, even for a joke. I brewed tea. I ate the tamale from my pocket over the sink like a teenager. At 3, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and when I opened it, I saw a photo of a receipt that showed a refund processed to a card that was not ours, and the note cash at desk. And I understood that Evan had pulled money to get around the hold, and that nobody in any system can save you from someone who wants to outrun his own shadow. And I felt the low point come in like a tide, quiet and relentless. And I let it come, because sometimes fighting the tide makes you choke. At 4, I walked the dog around the block and watched a neighbor's kids ride a new bike and a new scooter. And I waved to Mrs. Luna, who was arranging a small nativity, and she said, "Are you coming by later?" And I said, "Maybe." And she said, "I will save you a cookie with sprinkles just in case." And I said, "Thank you." And then my phone vibrated in my pocket, and it was a text from Bree, and it said he is yelling about a hotel policy now, and a man at the desk wants to see his ID, and he just stormed outside. And I thought how sad a temper is on a holiday. And I typed back, "Thank you for the information, and then do not put yourself in the middle." And she typed, "I will not." And then added, "I did not wear the bracelet today." And I read that line twice and wondered what it cost her to say it. At 5, Ramon called one more time, and I stepped into my bedroom and closed the door because things sound different when a door is shut. And he said bad news and good. And I stood very still to hold them both. And he said, "Bad news is security told me if I approach again today, I will be banned from the property because some guests are recording and they are worried about a scene on Christmas. Good news is the woman you spoke with left the key card folio on a side table when she went to the desk, and I got the room number confirmed, and the car tag in the lodge makes guests list dinner times on a card for the steakhouse, and I took a photo of it. And if you want, I can be in the lot at 6:45 when they walk to dinner and hand the packet to him on the public sidewalk before he reaches the door." And I said yes, but only if there is a clean line of public access. And he said, "Sidewalk is county, not lodge." And I said, "Okay." And then I said, "If that fails, we will try the day after at his office." And he said, "I do not fail often. But if I do, I know how to show up again." And I said, "Me too." And we hung up, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the blue binder on the nightstand and thought about how all the pages in it still add up to a life I want, even if one chapter is being crossed out in red. At 6, my mother texted a photo of the table with bowls of pozole and plates of cookies, and my sister making a face because my uncle told a story with too many details. And I smiled and felt a twist of grief for the Christmas I thought I was going to have. The one with matching pajamas and a movie after dinner. And I let myself feel it whole because grief is not a thing you can cut into pieces and eat later. And when it passed, I stood and put on boots and walked outside, and felt the cold take the last of the heat I had been carrying like a fever. At 6:40, my phone was on the table in front of me, and I watched the small numbers in the corner change, and I held my breath for the buzz I wanted, and at 6:45, it buzzed, and I jumped. And it was a text from my bank that said a transfer had been made from a linked savings to the joint checking by an authorized user, and my stomach dropped, because that was money I had not known he could reach, and the amount was the exact hole the lodge deposit had made earlier. And I cursed into the empty room in a language that feels like home when you are hurting. And then the phone lit up again, and it was Ramon, and I swiped, and he said, "I am in the spot. I see them walking. He has his hands in his pockets, and the woman is 3 steps behind. I am stepping out now." And I pressed the phone to my ear like proximity could make me strong. And he said, "Sir, I have legal papers for you." And the wind through the line made his words sound like a radio in a storm. And then he said he turned his shoulder. I moved to his left. He cut to the curb. A car rolled by, and the splash from the tire hit my shoe. And I said, "Careful." And he said, "I do not want that." And I said, "Service does not require you wanting it." And I held it out. And the woman reached a hand like she might take it for him. And he said, "No." And I said, "Miss, I cannot serve you." And she pulled back like she knew the rule. And then a man came out of the steakhouse with a tray of champagne, and everyone cheered from inside because there was some birthday or proposal, and your husband used that noise like a cover and slid through the door as the server stepped forward, and I could not reach around him without knocking the tray. And I am not that man. And the door closed, and the host blocked me because the house manager had told him to. And now I am standing outside looking at the closed door, and I am calling to say I failed. And I sat down slowly on my own kitchen chair and put my hand flat on the table and said, "Thank you for trying, and thank you for not making a child cry, or a server drop his tray on a holiday." And he exhaled and said, "I will be here when they come out again." And I said, "Go home. It is enough for today." And he said, "Tomorrow I will try the exit road." And I said, "Tomorrow the courthouse is closed, but the world is not." And we hung up. And then I put my head down on my arms like a person in a schoolroom who needs a minute. And I let myself cry once. Not loud, just one long sound that came from somewhere old. And when it was done, I washed my face and gave the dog her last walk and texted my mother that I would see her in the morning. And I went to bed in my house that was warm and safe in mine. And I lay there in the dark and thought I built a machine with paper and timing and help, and for now it would not run. And the thought sat heavy as a winter coat. And then I told myself what I have told strangers at my window more times than I can count, that sometimes the first pass fails and then you come back with better light. And I fell asleep holding that sentence like a rail. I woke at 5 even though I had fallen asleep at midnight because the house had the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And I made coffee in the dark and stood at the window while the streetlights clicked off one by one and thought about how yesterday had bent away from my plan and how plans are not promises. They are maps. And maps do not change the land. They only make it easier to find your way. And I told myself to aim for the next clear landmark and not stare at the whole range, and that helped me breathe. And then, at 7, my phone buzzed with a text from Ramon that said, "I will swing past your block tonight. Give me a heads up when you see headlights. No extra charge for a neighborhood run." And I texted, "Thank you." And then I made a list for the day after Christmas because I am a person who likes lists, even when the rest of life looks like a drawer spilled on the floor. And the list said, call utility to put a password on the account, pick up extra dog food, box Evan's things that are only his, return the mint scarf, and bring my mother the poinsettia I forgot in the trunk. And then I added, do not argue and do not explain, because I have learned that you can speak only one language at a time. And I picked calm. Before noon, I stopped by my mother's with the poinsettia and a container of pozole she sent me home with anyway. And she touched my cheek with a careful hand and said, Mija, when are you coming for dinner? And I said tonight, after I finish a thing, and she did not ask what the thing was, because she had seen that look on my grandmother when a decision had been made, and there was nothing to discuss until the thing was done. And she pressed a cookie with sprinkles into my palm and told me to eat it on the way, so I would not forget sweetness. And I promised I would. And then I drove to a strip mall and returned the scarf. And the cashier asked if there was anything wrong with it, and I said, it is not my color. And she laughed and said, my sister says that about half the closet, and I smiled and left, without telling her that sometimes a color is not a color. It is a lie you do not want wrapped around your neck. In the afternoon, I opened the hall closet and pulled down a stack of old grocery boxes, and I put into them the things I knew were Evan's alone. His signed baseball, his fraternity mug, his winter boots that never fit me, 3 hoodies that smell like cedar, and a bar soap we do not buy. And I put the boxes by the door, and I labeled them with a marker in neat block letters because neat letters make people take you seriously even when they are mad. And then I took a photo of the labels and sent it to my own email to time-stamp the list. And that small act of record-keeping steadied me more than any deep breath could. At 4, his mother texted a photo of the sunset over Santa Fe and wrote, I hope you and my son make peace today. And I looked at the picture and thought, peace is not something you get by wishing. It is something you get by telling the truth and doing the next right thing. And I typed back, I hope he tells you the truth. And she sent a thumbs up like the tiny version of approval you give when you have nothing to add. And I put my phone face down and told Bean we were okay. And she wagged, because dogs accept statements of fact better than people do. At 8, the night had settled heavy and clear, and I turned on only the tree lights and sat in the chair by the window with the blue binder on the side table like an anchor. And I watched the street like people used to watch a horizon for sails, and at 8:47 a set of headlights turned onto our block, and slowed like a person checking house numbers in the dark. And my phone buzzed twice, once from Ramon saying parked 2 houses down, and once from Evan saying almost home babe, save me some cocoa. And I put the phone on the table and stood and told my legs to be still. And the car pulled into the driveway too fast and then braked, like he realized he did not know how to enter this scene, and the engine clicked as it cooled, and the porch light caught the side of his face as he came up the path. And he looked at me through the glass and put on a smile that had worked 1,000 times before. And then he saw that I had not unlocked the deadbolt, and the smile slid off like a sticker that has been peeled too many times. I opened the front door but left the screen latched because sometimes a thin thing is all you need to mark a line. And I said, you can take the boxes with your name on them and your overnight bag from the hall. And he said, what is this? And I said, this is a boundary. And he laughed once like I had told a joke in a language he did not speak and said, stop, Nora. Stop making a big thing. We had a plan. You were going to meet me later, and I said I did not have a plan to meet you at a lodge. Your plan did not include me. And he opened his mouth like a person about to argue a fine point. And then a shape moved in the corner of my eye, and Ramon stepped from the shadow of the oleander and walked up the path with his hands out and said, good evening, sir. Are you Evan Alvarez? And Evan turned toward him with anger and confusion on his face, like 2 lights flickering. And he said, who are you? And Ramon said, I am a process server. I have legal papers for you. And Evan shook his head and stepped back and said, I am not taking that. And Ramon said, receipt is not required. And he spoke in the same steady tone I use when someone is trying to fight with the rules. And he set the envelope against Evan's chest so it touched his coat and said, You have been served. And then he put the envelope on the porch rail when Evan would not take it in his hand. And he looked at me and tipped an invisible hat like a man finishing a small job well. And he said to Evan in the same even voice, the court date and case number are on the first page. And then he stepped off the path and walked back into the street where his car idled. And I loved him for not lingering to watch the show. Evan stared at the envelope like it might bite. And then he picked it up with 2 fingers and held it at arm's length and said, Are you serious? And I said, I am serious and I am calm, and that is not a combination you have seen in me, but it is who I am now. And he said, You filed on Christmas. And I said I filed on Christmas Eve at 8:03 in the morning. And he shook his head like a dog coming out of water and said, You are cruel. And I said, I am not cruel. I am done. And he said, We can talk inside. And I said, The house is mine, and I am not inviting you in tonight. You can take the boxes and your bag and go to your mother's or a hotel, and we will set a time with a witness for you to gather the rest after New Year's. And he put his hand on the screen door handle, and I let my voice drop into the tone I use at work when someone is about to cross a line, and I said, Do not. And he froze because that tone works on people who think they are not afraid of anything, and he let go of the handle. For a minute he looked small, younger than he is, and he said, I messed up. Okay. I did. I got carried away. I thought I could make it a surprise, and then explain later. And I said, You used our money for a story where I was not invited and you called that a surprise. And he said, Work has been hard and I needed to feel like I could still do something big. And I said, You can do something big by telling the truth in small ways every day. And he said, I am telling you now. And I said, You are telling me because you got caught. And he flinched like the word was a thrown pebble. And then he tried anger because anger has served him when shame does not. And he said, HR called me. You went to them? How could you do that to my bonus? And I said, I did not do anything to your bonus. Your choices did. And he said, I earned that money. And I said, The policy you signed says otherwise, when you use your power to buy gifts for someone on your team. And he said, It was not like that. And I said, Then you can explain that to them. And he said, Where am I supposed to go tonight? And I said, Your mother's house is warm and safe, and she loves you. And my mother is warm and safe, and she loves me. And tonight we are not the same household. And he breathed through his nose like a bull and then let it out. And he picked up a box and then another and set them on the porch, and then walked them to his car without looking back at me. And when he came for the last one, he paused and said, What about Bean? And Bean lifted her head behind my legs like she knew we were saying her name. And I said, She stays with me. And he nodded short like he had been expecting that answer since August and did not know how to argue with it. And he said, I will come back tomorrow to talk. And I said, Text first. And he nodded again. And then he said the scarf did not look as green in the store. And I said I returned it. And the way his face fell made me feel mean for a second. So I added, We need a new fence more than a scarf. And he looked at the cracked boards along the back where the wind had pushed last spring, and he nodded slow like he remembered a different version of himself who cared about things like fences. And he said, Okay. And then he left, and the night felt taller. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the cool wood and thanked the room for holding me up. And then I texted my mother, I am on my way. Save me soup. And she sent back a string of hearts like confetti. And I put on my coat and grabbed the pozole and beans leash, and we drove. through quiet streets to a small house that smells like cumin and laundry, and my mother opened the door and said, "There's my girl," and handed me a bowl and a spoon, like a ceremony. And I ate and felt the heat travel through me and settle my bones. And I slept on her couch under a crocheted blanket my grandmother made the year I was born. And in the morning, I woke to coffee and the sound of my mother humming in the kitchen and the light that looks only like December. And I felt the kind of peace that is not loud, the kind you do not show off because it is yours alone. The day after Christmas, I went to work because the courthouse does not stop for the stories that happen inside it. And I stamped papers and answered questions and pointed people toward the rooms where decisions are made. And at 10, I stepped into the stairwell again and answered a call from Candace. And she said we concluded the initial review. The policy is clear. He is on paid leave pending a formal process. The bonus is forfeited under Section 7. And I said, "Thank you for telling me." And she said, "I know this is personal for you, but I want you to know we would have made the same decision if you were a stranger." And I said, "I believe you." And she said, "The woman on his team came in this morning and made a statement." And I said, "Good." And after I hung up, I sat on the bottom step and looked at the scuffed paint on the railing and felt a mixture of sadness and relief, because even when you are right, loss is still loss. At noon, Bree texted me one last time and said I told HR everything. I am asking to be moved to another team. I am returning the bracelet to him. They will not take it back because of the engraving, which makes sense. I will sell it and give the money to my sister to cover a tuition payment she has been stressed about. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I am stepping out of this story. And I typed back, "Thank you for telling the truth when it counted, and I wish you well." And then I put my phone away and went back to my window because there were people waiting who needed help today, and I could not be in two stories at once. In the days that followed, we did the practical things that end a marriage the way you close a house for the season, one valve at a time. Not because you want to, but because the pipes will burst if you do not. And we made a list of property and set a date with a witness. And I put his boxes on the porch at the agreed time, and my neighbor stood on her lawn with a cup of tea like a notary to the human part of it. And he parked and nodded to her, and to me, and carried his things to his car, and did not cross the line I had drawn in my voice. And when he came for his baseball, he paused and looked at the mountain and said, "I miss us." And I said, "I miss who I thought we were." And he nodded like that sentence matched a tune he knew, and then he left. And the quiet after he turned the corner was not empty. It was full of my own breath. I fixed the fence with the money I had moved because that is what it was for. And I stood with the man from the hardware store and we measured the sag and the wind gap. And he said, "You are smart to do this now before the February winds come." And I thought how nice it was to be called smart for a choice that had only to do with wood and nails. And I learned how to set a post level by watching a video a teenager recorded in his backyard. And I liked the way the dirt felt solid under my boots as I tamped it. And Bean watched every move like she was judging a contest. And when we were done, she trotted the length of the fence twice and wagged like a foreman signing off. On New Year's Eve, I sat on my mother's porch and watched distant fireworks creep up from the valley, and I felt the year turn under me. And I thought about the first Christmas when we ate pie soup and laughed, and about this Christmas when I filed papers and did not laugh. And I felt those two nights sit side by side in me like stones that could both be true. And I told myself the truth that endings are allowed to be quiet, and that not every story needs a speech at its finish, and that my revenge was not the serve on the sidewalk or the hold on the bonus. Though those had their own clean music, it was the way I took my life back in small, exact steps and refused to carry a lie one more inch. In January, a letter came from the jeweler because Riveria Fine sends a warranty card whether you want one or not, and the card listed the bracelet as part of their E+A winter collection, which stands for Ever Plus Always. And I looked at those letters and I laughed a little in my kitchen because I had let that tiny tag bruise me for a night. And it turned out it was only a brand selling a feeling. And I thought that is what he had been doing too, selling a feeling. And I was done buying it. And I slid the card into the blue binder under a tab that says, Exhibits, not because I needed it for court, but because it felt right to file the story where it belonged. And then I closed the binder and put it back on the shelf beside the dog treats and the envelopes. I do not know yet how the last loose ends will tie, because life is not a clean docket and people are not forms. But I know the shape of my days now, and it is a shape I can live inside. And I walk Bean along the arroyo and wave at Mrs. Luna and return my mother's bowls on time. And I sit at my window in the courthouse and help people find the papers they need to change their lives. And I use the steady voice I taught myself on a holiday, where the world tells you to be soft. And I am soft when I choose. And I am firm when I must be. And I do not apologize for either. And some nights I walk out to the driveway and look up at the sandias turning watermelon, and I remember that the sky does not ask your permission to change, and it does not ask forgiveness for having clouds. And I breathe and let the cold air clear the last smoke from the room, and I go back inside to the life I kept, which is to say, the life I am building. One page, one fence post, one quiet choice at a time.